So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever in the world you are joining us from. I'm Negin Ali Soltani, Assistant Professor at University Gustave Eiffel in Paris, and I'll be moderating this session today. Thank you, Hamidur, for coordinating the Zoom. Welcome to the Western Session 3, Equity, Accessibility, and Disadvantaged Populations. I just did a quick check to see if all the presenters are here, and fortunately everyone is present, so we can start the session. We were originally had Kyunwin Gu as the first presenter, but we moved this presentation to another session. So we'll begin with our second presentation, Montaha Reynoel, our first speaker from University of California, Irvine. And he will present his work exploring a spatial analysis of commuting patterns in the Los Angeles area.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Montana. I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll get into it. Actually, this presentation will be on a similar topic, but since submitting my work, I've expanded it to the whole state of California, and I think the results will be more interesting. So today I'll present to you a spatial analysis of long-distance commute generation and attraction in the state of California. So what is long-distance commuting? Long-distance commuting has different definitions depending on where you are in the world. In the US, where distances tend to be a bit larger, we use the definition of 50 miles one way. So that's just a one-way commute, and it's a network distance, not a straight line distance. And you might be asking yourself, why is it important to study long distance commuting specifically? So there are a variety of negative and positive impacts associated with long distance commuting. Negative impacts on the generation side, we mean aggregated at the home level or where you're starting your commute from, your residence, right? So personally, you may have negative mental health impacts, physical health impacts from being away from your home so long, or if you're sitting for long periods of time, right? You may have negative impacts to your family and community if you're not able to interact socially, if you're away the whole day working plus commuting. Because long distance commuters tend to spend almost their entire day either at work or getting to and from work. And that also impacts local businesses. They're not able to support the local economy. They get lunch, they do other services away from home, far away from home, actually, near their work. Although there are some positives, they are able to access more employment opportunities than they otherwise would be able to, and may be able to afford a home, as they cannot afford one near their workplace, but they could afford one very far out. On the attraction side, on the workplace side, there are some, negatives and positives as well. Local residents who work in an area but do not pay local taxes, they use services, water, road maintenance, electricity, etc., but they don't pay taxes for those. Although they do support business growth, economic growth, they support the economy near where they work, and they support businesses where they work. So kind of a mixed bag there. Our study has a few objectives. We wanted to determine what factors were associated with either higher or lower rates of long distance commuting at the census tract level. So not the individual level, but more of at a population level. And we're going to compare what factors were more associated with generation versus attraction, as well as our findings to prior literature on general commuting overall. There hasn't been as much study on specifically long distance commuting, but there's a lot of literature on factors that affect commuting just in general. We're also going to look at spatial regressive techniques, how we aggregate variables based and measurements based on their proximity to one another to see if that's an improvement over traditional regression. And we're going to look at if factors are consistent across study areas, or if they vary geographically. And what do I mean by study areas? Well, we looked at the whole state of California. That's over 35 million people. And we broke it into four different study areas. We have Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, and Fresno. These are all major cities in California. And they are A bit different. San Francisco and Los Angeles are much larger cities, polycentric, while Fresno is more agricultural, and San Diego is a more of a medium-sized city. So those urban form characteristics do affect our results. As far as our data, we mainly took data from the U.S. Census Bureau, and our network, which we used to calculate our distances, was the California Statewide Travel Demand Network. In total, we had a little over 8,000 census tracts in our final data set. So quite a significant data set there. Our variables that we used, and all of them were taken from prior literature or inspiration. We had socio-demographic variables, household composition variables, employment, and urban form type variables. Um, and the social demographic variables we broke down by both race and ethnicity, as someone's culture may impact their predisposition to not only where they live, but how they commute. We also looked at prior literature on a variety of employment industry clusters, of which we segmented the employment market into five distinct industry clusters. We had goods producing industries as one. We had retail, transportation, utilities as another industry cluster. Both of those first two industry clusters don't tend to require a lot of formal education, higher level university education. Our three other industry clusters were education itself. We had food and accommodation, and then all other fields, STEM, managerial, financial fields, were our final industry cluster, which was our reference population there. And then as far as urban form went, we had total population as well as population and job densities. We had the proportion of construction date of housing units, and we had some variables measuring kind of equity impacts like food accessibility, pollution burden, et cetera. So we had a lot of things in this model, but many of them were significant. We'll get into those results now. Real quick, we could visualize the long distance commute rate for different census tracts. Here is the generation rate. So that is where we've aggregated it and studied it in two separate ways. One is at the residence where commutes are coming from, the origins, which is what we're seeing here. And we could see that there does appear to be some kind of a spatial correlation here as you get farther away from the urban cores of given central cities, the rate does tend to increase. And we also have the attraction rate, which is the workplace commutes coming in, what percentage are long distance. And it's a little bit more spread out than at the residential level, right? So our methodology, we estimated both a generation and attraction model for each study area. So we had 8 models in total. Before estimating our models, we first evaluated the spatial correlation to see if that would be an appropriate technique to use. So we estimated the Moran's I statistics for all of our explanatory variables, and we saw that the vast majority of them were significantly spatially correlated, as well as the long distance commute rate itself was significantly spatially correlated in all study areas except for Fresno. Furthermore, we tested for correlations in spatial error, as well as we tested our spatial lag both in an initial OLS model and further specifications of various spatial models, and we found that many measurements were spatially correlated. So ultimately, we did go with a spatial Durbin model formulation, which I'll explain on the next slide. Something to keep in mind when we go over results is all of our variables were z-score normalized. So results would be relative to one standard deviation. This was to aid in interpretation between study areas, as different study areas may have elevated means, medians, etc. Of various factors, but we're interested in is one factor strong in one area relative to what the normal is for that given study area, right? Knowing that some areas have elevated levels of any particular variable, just in general. And we also for our dependent variable, we took the logit of that because it is a rate, of course, and as such is bounded. We need an unbounded variable in a regression. So here's our final model formulation. And as we could see, we do have a spatial weights matrix component of which that specifies what census tract is a neighbor to another census tract, right? and we did a second order weights matrix. So and it's Queen's formulation. If you're not familiar with that, that is if a census tract is neighboring another census tract at either an edge or a point, it is considered a neighbor, and it has a weight of 1. If it is a neighbor of a neighbor, so indirect neighbor, it gets a weight of 0.5, and otherwise we did not consider farther out spatial effects. Um, and the spatial Dober model calculates or takes into account spatial correlation both from independent variables and the dependent variable itself. So anyway, what were our results? Our results for our generation models on average, of which there were 4, we had an average spatial pseudo R squared of 0.73, so relatively good fit there. Our variables were explaining quite a lot in our model. And generally, and this goes for both attraction and generation, all the variables, very few were both significant and consistent in all 4 study areas. There tended to be variations between study areas in what was important and what was not significant, right? So here we've only included the most consistent variables as indicated in the parentheses. But we did see a lot of socio-demographic variables were significant on the generation side, and many variables related to the ethnic minority heritage of people did tend to lower long distance commute generation rates. Although for Native Americans, the areas with higher concentrations of people of that heritage did tend to generate higher rates of long distance commuting. We also found that incomes and the time at which units were built did affect generation rates as well as vehicle household counts. On the attraction side, however, our spatial pseudo R squared was 0.38 on average. So much lower than on the generation side, but still pretty good. And we found that more urban form variables did come through. We saw population density was a big factor on attraction. On the attraction side, that higher population dense areas did have lower long distance commute attraction rates. And we saw a little bit more employment variables coming through here. The employment industry cluster of which residents worked in, as well as what jobs were present in different census tracts, more important. So what do our results mean? So a little bit talking about that is that generally our generation model, they perform better than our attraction models. And this tells us that there may be some more factors associated with long distance commute attraction that we didn't identify, and there could be improvements there. But overall, we did find that socio-demographic factors influenced long distance commute generation more than they did for attraction. Whereas where jobs were located, specific jobs in specific industries, as well as the population density, were more associated with long distance commute attraction than they were with generation, which, kind of makes sense. Factors that are more personal to you may influence if you're going to be a long distance commuter or not, whereas factors related to distribution of resources in the urban area kind of dictate where you go, where you want to travel to. Now, we did see that construction time period though, and your personal employment, not where jobs are, but what industry workers work in, were significant in both generation and attraction. And somewhat surprisingly, we saw that household composition as if you were married or not, or if you had children or not. And by if I'm not talking about a person, what I mean is the rate in a given census tract, right? Were not consistently associated with either long distance commute generation or attraction. And many variables, again, they did vary by study area. Most of the indirect effects were actually found to either be inconsistent or insignificant. They may have only been significant in 1 or 2 of our models. Compared to the direct effects of a given variable were more consistent and significant, even taking into account the spatial correlations. So comparing to prior literature, what differences did we notice? Well, we noticed a lot of similarities. We noticed that higher rates of owner occupancy, higher vehicle counts, both of these are associated with more suburban lifestyles, right? They did have higher rates of long distance commute generation. That tends to make sense. People who live farther out from urban cores probably have to, or more likely, right, to commute to access job resources. However, we did see some interesting things. We saw that, for example, higher rates of grocery accessibility, which is generally taken as accessibility to fresh foods and produce, right? They had higher rates of long distance commute attraction, but lower rates of long distance commute generation. However, that also lines up with prior literature, as in if certain people are in neighborhoods or regions or communities where they lack essential services, jobs, food, medicine, for example, they are more likely to seek and maintain employment actually outside of their neighborhood if they could access these necessities around their workplace. However, we did find a lot of dissimilarities with prior literature. I want to emphasize that most of this literature comes from general commuting, right? We're specifically looking at long distance commuting here. So this is not necessarily a contradiction. We found that immigrant or migrant background, as well as the length of residency in which you lived in a particular census tract or county, were insignificant in factors for both long distance commute generation and attraction. Um, although some studies had suggested that that might be a factor in people's commuting choices. But we also found that higher rates of elderly in census tracts, as well as higher rates of single parent households, they were associated with higher rates of long distance commute generation. Which we'll get into. That presents some equity concerns as we go forward. And we also saw that higher incomes had lower rates of long distance commute generation. Previously, a lot of literature suggested that STEM jobs, higher paying jobs, higher incomes in general managerial positions, all of these contributed to longer on average commutes. But it appears when you're focusing only on long distance commuting, maybe the burdens are much more than what a normal commute would be, and people with the means, with better jobs, as we saw, the two lowest paying job industry clusters had the highest rates of long distance commute generation, as well as lower incomes tended to generate higher rates of long distance commuting. Um, and so that brings us to kind of some equity impacts. One is specifically for Los Angeles. We did identify kind of what you could call it a feedback loop for long distance commute generation and attraction. In that very significantly, areas with higher rates of either were associated with spatial spillover effects, whereas one census tract would have a higher rate and it would affect its neighboring census tracts by also raising their rates. Or now that causal and effect relationship is not exactly proven, but it does show that there are clusters specifically in Los Angeles of census tracts that maybe the whole community is long distance commute disadvantaged. They have concentrations of those negative impacts. We also found that Native American communities might be disproportionately impacted, right? In all models, um, census tracts with elevated rates from that community had elevated rates of long distance commute generation and attraction, and indirectly, even it was significant in Los Angeles and San Diego. Um, Caregivers also may be feeling the burden disproportionately with census tracts with higher rates of single parents and people 65 years and older. They tended to generate higher rates of long distance commuting. However, if you have someone at home that needs care, but you're spending hours a day getting to work, then hours a day at work, that may be difficult in managing those responsibilities, right? And we also saw that generally newer neighborhoods had higher rates of long distance commute with generation and attraction. The older neighborhoods, really pre 1980s, were significantly lowered those rates. So that tells us something about how we're designing our cities going forward, how we're designing our suburbs, and how maybe that's contributing to some burdens there, and how something may need to be reevaluated in our design philosophies. We also saw that pollution disadvantaged areas had higher rates of long distance commute generation in both Los Angeles and San Francisco. These areas tend to have higher elevated rates of physical health ailments, cancers, asthma from air pollution, right? And long distance commuting does impact one's physical health negatively. So that's kind of a compounding burden there. So what could be some policy implications here? Well, we could first recognize that long distance commuting impacts different communities differently. It's not an even impact throughout any study area. Um, and maybe, for example, looking at jobs and industries, right? Certain industries had elevated rates of either long distance commute generation or attraction, either at their employee side or at where the jobs are located. And investments could be made to either help better businesses maybe locate branch offices or relocate their facilities to areas where their workers are coming from, so they don't have to commute as far. Or maybe investments could be made in job programs that better train or match workers with their existing skills to jobs closer to their home. Generally, investments could be made in Native American communities to provide better employment opportunities, so they don't, on average, have to seek out farther away destinations for employment. In addition, the employment that is in their communities maybe could be better filled by locals. We saw that in their communities, even they had an elevated rate of long distance commute attraction, meaning that employment opportunities that are present are not being filled by locals. Um, and generally, I think this would we could expand child and elder care services. I think this would be beneficial for all peoples, really, but especially communities with elevated rates of long distance commuting, where caretakers are away for the majority of the day. They may need more access to daycare, to senior centers, etc. And overall, we could incentivize maybe development patterns to promote shorter commutes, take inspiration from our older, more mixed-use neighborhoods, see what the differences are and why older neighborhoods don't tend to generate as much long-distance commuting as newer neighborhoods do. And when we're looking at road usage charges, which is especially relevant in California, is implementing one relatively soon, which is a charge based on the miles you drive, and there could be potential penalties for excessive driving. We need to make sure that long distance commute burdened communities are not further encumbered or burdened by additional fees when opportunities don't exist necessarily for them to work near their community. It's one thing to say, we're going to penalize you for driving far away to work when you could work near your home. But if there's no opportunity to work near your home, that's not really a fair fee to pay. So some key takeaways from our studies that a one-size-fits-all interpretation is not necessarily appropriate for any policy or any one factor, right? We saw a lot of variation between our four study areas, saying that tells us that local factors and local influences, environmental influences, are important on how different explanatory variables express themselves. Although we did see some trends that could give you some insights, right? It's important to really think about the local area you're studying in particular. We did see that all explanatory variables were significantly spatially correlated, and the long distance commute rate itself did significantly influence neighboring long distance commute rates in 6 out of 8 models. However, many of the indirect effects were actually insignificant or they were inconsistent. So what does this tell us? It tells us that um, there may not be many indirect effects as you would initially think from seeing significantly spatially correlated variables. However, the errors were significantly spatially correlated. The variables themselves were. So we still feel that including some form of spatial correlation in model formulation is important to make sure that models are estimated accurately and that distributions of error terms are correctly modeled. Um, the long distance commute rate itself, we found that its behavior, its influence from explanatory variables was in many ways similar to general commuting, but in also many ways it was different. And this suggests that these two behaviors or phenomenons are not equal and they should be studied differently. Some factors that influence general commuting in one way may have an opposing effect on long distance commuting. And studies like ours, we used a lot of data from the U.S. Census, from a few other organizations, and we had millions of origin and destination pairs represented. And that kind of big data really helps us reveal trends and associations within the population, but it's difficult to determine cause and effect from that perspective. However, we feel like studies like ours can inspire future survey design to really target specific populations or ask the right questions when you do to determine what exactly is causing these trends in long distance commuting. Um, yeah, well, anyway, that concludes my presentation, and I hope it wasn't too fast. I was trying not to go over time. It's a lot to get through, right? But if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Montaha. So we can have some time for some questions. Please don't hesitate to raise your hand and unmute yourself to ask your questions. You can even put it in the chat. Yes, please.
You have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I guess maybe two parts. Are most of long distance commutes kind of in the direction of most morning commute flow or against the main direction of flow? And then also, were you able to look at like the behaviors of all the adults in a household, right? Because what I'm getting at is like one parent or adult might have a short commute and the other one has a long commute. Was that predictive in any way, or do you have the data to analyze that?
So I'll answer your second part first. We did not analyze that exactly. We looked at the aggregated rates of at the census tract level. So we did not look at specific households. And we did not have the data to say, oh, it is a two adult household. One of them is commuting in this way, one of them is commuting in this way. We only have the rates of two adult household, one adult household with or without children, etc. And then the aggregated rate of long distance commuting for that given census tract. And as far as your first question as well, we actually did not look at that. We didn't take into account directionality. In when we examined it, we only looked at spatially, we could look at some of these maps maybe. Um, Generally, for example, if you take Los Angeles, right, most commutes tend to flow east to west.
Yeah.
And we also see in that direction, long distance commute generation rate decreases east to west. But we did not look at if these commutes were going necessarily east or west, north or south, etc.
Yeah, they probably are. Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? Is there any in chat? I can't exactly see the chat right now. Maybe I have to.
I don't see any question in the chat, but I have a question.
Okay.
So you see the variations between the different study areas.
Yes.
So considering these variations, how would you recommend to extend or adopt your model for other states or other countries?
Well, that's a good question. I think really the improvement is more so in the model formulation itself, in taking into account, like I said, a lot of the variables are spatially correlated, and the errors are also spatially correlated. That affects the distributions of the error terms, the distributions of a variety of factors. And I feel like if that is not properly modeled, then there's omitted variable bias potentially. There are unaccounted for errors in the model. And if you were to estimate all of these models again using, for example, OLS estimation, the results would be quite different in many, many factors. So I feel that taking the spatial correlation into account is a more important takeaway than saying any one result, for example, being married increases one's likelihood of being a long distance commuter. To really get into that cause and effect, I feel like there needs to be more targeted out at the individual level studies, and probably different countries experience different effects. Even looking at the literature review I did for this paper, generally North American, Canadian, and United States studies tended to align. However, many European or Asian papers found opposing effects with regard, for example, to say income, right? In the US, higher incomes tended to lead to longer commutes, while in the European Union, they found the opposite effect. So I think definitely how people's background, how they were raised, does influence, I think, a lot of their decisions in how they commute.
Thank you very much. Is there any other questions? Okay, thank you, Montana, for your interesting presentation. We continue to our next presentation. Our second speaker is Arna Nishita Nitila from the University of Arkansas, and she will present her study on the links between mode usage, daily activities, and quality of life for older adults.
Thank you for introducing me. So I am sharing my screen now. Okay. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, very well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So good morning, everyone. I am Orna Nishita Nithila. I am a PhD student of University of Arkansas. It's an honor to present our research in this conference. So my presentation title is Exploring the Links Between Activities, Mode Uses, and Quality of Life Among Older Adults. So when we think of mobility for older adults, we often think of cars, buses, or even paratransits. But mobility is more than movement for older adults. It's about access to their groceries, healthcare, social events, and daily routines that support their connection and independence. Unlike other age groups, older adults face serious transportation barriers. Over 10 million people live with disabilities that limit their everyday activities. And many of them stop their driving. It's not by their choice, but due to their health conditions. Especially in rural areas where transit options are scarce and services are far apart, their transportation access shrinks. So does their ability to participate in different activities. And when their participation drops, so it also have impact on their quality of life. So our study explores how their transportation mode uses, activity participation, and quality of life are interconnected with each other, and especially in communities where there are limited transportation options. So to understand the full picture, we looked into the different literature, and we also found some valuable insights and key research gaps. Research shows strong links between transportation and quality of life. For instance, Bannister and Bowling found that older adults with limited access to with access to a car or walkable environment report higher quality of life. And another study found that out of home activities related to life satisfaction. And Spinney used Canadian Time use data to show that community-based travel like volunteering or socializing boosts quality of life. Recent studies by Barstead and also Delbos and Stanley also highlighted how travel satisfaction is connected to transportation disadvantage and which eventually impact their emotional well-being. But most of these studies examine transportation or activity participation separately. Few studies explores how these two things interact with each other. Even few account for important confounding factors such as residential self-selection or car ownership endogeneity. Only a few US-based studies like Kim and Wolferson or Watch begin to model this relationship, but even they fall short of capturing the full complexity. So, what's the research gap here? Most of these studies only focus on either transportation mode uses or activity participation, but none of them compiling these two factors together to explore their relationship with quality of life. So on top of that, many of these studies overlook confounding factors like residential self-selection or car ownership endogenities. So that's where our study comes in. We connect this dot together, mode uses, activity participation, and their joint impact of quality of life, while also controlling for the hidden biases. So this holistic and data-driven approach can better inform policy, planning, and technology, especially for underserved older adults population. So for this study area, we selected Arkansas as a case study. So Arkansas offers a unique setting for this research. It's like the sixth most rural state in the US, with nearly 45% of its population living in the rural areas, and compared to the national average of 19%. It has also the one of the highest aging population per capita, with especially like a higher dependency ratio in rural counties. And also like transportation options in this area are also limited, which kind of create an ideal environment to understand the interplay between transportation mode users, activity participation, and quality of life among older adults. So our study, we collected the information from 6,000 older adults who is like 60 years or older. So we collected the data between October 2021 through October 2022. We received 1,017 responses and retained like 693 for analysis after the data cleaning process. So we used a structure equation modeling to test the relationship between the variable because we are seeing the interplay of transportation mode users, activity participation, and also their joint impact on the quality of life, also accounting for the car ownership endogeneity and also like the built environment impact. So our data set includes like activity participation. So in our study, we found like older adults listed like about 10 activities. So based on those 10 activities, we merged them together into three activities, the shopping, civic, and personal trips. For the mode uses, we merged those mode uses into three activities. The first three mode uses, like the first one is car uses, active mode uses, and also the other modes. And we also included like personal and household variables. For personal and household variables, we included age, gender, income, employment, driving status, and household composition. And for built environment, we use the smart location database where we can collect it like the intersection density, walkability, and land use mix variables. So to measure the quality of life, we assessed it through a composite measure encompassing like physical health, their emotional well-being, social functioning, and their life satisfaction. So this composite score was calculated by equal weighting like 16 self-reported items covering all of these domains. So each responses was standardized and aggregated to produce a continuous quality of life scores. And the higher values indicates the better overall well-being and the lower score indicate the lower quality of life. So this method ensured kind of a balanced and holistic assessment of their perceived quality of life among older adults. So this slide shows our conceptual framework for the structure equation model. So here we hypothesize that older adults' quality of life is shaped not just by their travel behaviors and activity participation, but also by their broader context in which those behavior occur, like, for example, their personal circumstances, car access, and the built environment, as I already mentioned. And this model also accounts for like the indirect impact, for instance, like how income affects like car ownership, and also then affects their activity participation, and which finally impacts their quality of life. So, so this is our like sample characteristics. From this finding, we found that our sample closely reflect the Arkansas overall older adults population in terms of race and income, but this sample like more representative of like male population and also like middle-aged older adults who is 70 to 79 years old, and majority of the older adults has a driving license, and 75 majority of them lives with the other household members. So here is like the average number of trips they made per day. So the thing is, we collected the data based on their 7 days routine, like how many trips they made in a week. So we converted into like per day trips. So here we found that the like most of the older adults in this study make fewer than one trip per day for any purpose, but civic and shopping trips are occur most frequently. The same thing is for like the mode uses. Like here we can see that car travel dominates among the older adults. This is not surprising in a rural state, but is also important because like car access becomes a key determinant of their mobility, and also like by extension for their quality of life. So, and if we see like for the uses of active mode uses and non-driving option, these options are also underutilized. So it's kind of raised question about their accessibility, safety, and service availability. So here are the findings of the quality of life indicators that we use for to measure the quality of life. So here you can see that nearly half of the respondent rated their physical health as excellent or very good, and 45% reported some limitations in their daily activities due to their health, and also 60% disagreed their life was close to ideal, and 70% are also unsatisfied with their life overall. So these are the kind of metrics we use for the overall quality of life measures. And now I would like to share the main takeaways from our structure equation model. So here is the findings from the like overall relationship of the quality like of the variable on the quality of life. So here we found that car availability and active mode uses significantly boost older adults' quality of life. And for the activity participation, shopping and civic trips improved quality of life, likely through the socialization, also like giving them a sense of autonomy. And for the personal trips, usually for health or like administrative purposes, correlated with the lower quality of life among older adults, most likely due to the stress or obligation. So the built environment also have significant impact. Our study found that those who live in the walkable areas reports higher quality of life. Now, if we look into the model results for the activity participation, here we found that like active car uses and active modes both positively associated with more shopping and civic trips, and also older age and being female is associated with fewer shopping and personal trips. Driving status is also strongly associated with greater activity participation overall. So these findings points to the structural disadvantages in how older adults, especially women and those with lower income, access opportunities for different engagements. Now, if we come to the results for the mode usage findings, here we found that car usage is higher among younger, wealthier, employed, and licensed older adults. And active mode usage is influenced by income, employment, and the built environment. And non-driving transportation alternatives are also common among women, non-drivers, and high-income older adults, but also remain underused like overall. And we also found some significant disparities when we are seeing the model results for the car availability and built environment. Here we found that older age, female gender, and older adults who live alone are negatively associated with car availability. And we also found that denser and walkable areas are also negatively associated with like car ownership. So white older adults are more likely to live in the workable neighborhood, indicating like a spatial inequality. So our study also highlighted how rural context shapes mobility and overall well-being of older adults. So in car-dependent states like Arkansas, where limited public transportation and active transportation are really scarce, car access is critical for maintaining their social participation and quality of life. And here in our study, we found that car uses acts as a key mediator enabling activity participation and that directly boosts older adults' quality of life. While built environment factors had little influence here, likely due to the low density and spread out nature of rural areas. So these findings underscores the urgent need of context specific solutions tailored to rural older adults. So, based on our findings, we recommend some strategies. For example, like increase access to community shuttles or demand responses transit and older adults friendly rideshare services, especially in rural and underserved area. And also, as we see that like built environment, like relates to higher quality of life. So invest in pedestrian friendly infrastructure in neighborhood with high concentration of aging respondent to promote their like safe and active mobility. And also like as we already see that in our study, we found that like personal activities are negatively related with older adults low quality of life. So in that case, like expand telehealth, virtual banking, and online public services might reduce their travel burden for errand and healthcare services. And also, like develop targeted policy programs that address the mobility needs of low income, female, and non driving older adults to reduce disparities in access and well being. So to conclude, like mobility is for older adults, mobility is more than access. So by exploring the interlinked roles of mode users, activity participation, and overall quality of life, helps us to understand how this interplay works and how it can improve older adults' access to essential services and eventually impact their quality of life. So thank you for your time and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
If it's okay, I have a couple of questions. And it's okay?
Yes,
Yeah,
please go
yeah.
ahead.
Yes, okay. So thank you for a great presentation. It was fascinating and it's actually complete my PhD topic. I'm also a PhD student in Technion. And I was curious to ask you two questions. The first one of the solution that you suggested in the policy level is to access different services by banking services, by digitalization. And
Yeah.
I wonder if you took into account the barriers that elderly often have with using the app, not just for transport application, but also for banking, for doing a delivery from the supermarket. So I wonder how this solution can be uh, can um, can deal with the barriers of technology that elderly often cope with.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you for your question. So in that case, so we are kind of like thinking that some kind of technological training or education program might help them to get access to these things. And also, like in case of like I also kind of doing a study in Arkansas. So here we found that like there are so many libraries and community organizations are there which can offer this kind of education programs that might help them to teach how to use those kind of online banking and all of those stuffs. And as we can see, like in our study, we found that like the uses of non-driving transportation options are really scarce in those areas, and older adults who are like starts to stop their driving. So in that case, how do they access to those personal activities which are far away from their place? So in that case, like online banking and online shopping or deliveries might help them.
Yeah.
But in to access those services, we need some kind of training that might be offered from some local organizations or community organizations, libraries. So these kind of things we might think of.
Thank you very much, and I'll contact you. It was fascinating and important
Yeah.
for my PhD. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's a great question.
We have another question in the chat.
Okay.
So they ask, did your model include any interaction effects, for example, between gender and race?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the thing is, we didn't include any kind of interaction effect, but we did try to see like when we are finalizing our model. So we did explore that options, but it didn't like came out good. So this is the final model is the results that we got, like kind of the best results based on the fitness value and other things. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? Okay, so we continue to the next presentation. Thank you very much, Arna, for this interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Olivia Gold, University Assistant and Pre-Doc Researcher at Boku University, Vienna's Institute of Transport Studies. And she will present her research on vulnerable households in Austria and how they are affected by climate policies. So, Olivia, can you please share your slides?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hello, my name is Olivia. I'm a PhD student at Boku University in Vienna at the Institute of Transport Studies. Astrid Günemann and Paul Pfaffenbichler are my supervisors. And today I am delighted to share our project Transfer and our paper titled Impacts of Climate Policies and Coping Strategies of Vulnerable Households in Austria. We have found solutions that make it possible to become climate neutral by 2040, while also ensuring that this is done in a socially just way. At the beginning of the project, if you look on the right side of the screen, we held a stakeholder workshop where options for compensation measures for mobility poor households were discussed. The results of this workshop were then incorporated into our models. The Austrian government has set the ambitious target to fully decarbonize passenger transport by 2040. While there has been progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in other sectors, emissions from transport have increased by 59% since 1990. Existing policies have significant gaps and will not be enough to achieve the target. To close this gap, additional measures such as carbon pricing, subsidies, and regulatory policies are needed. However, these measures could have disproportionate impacts on vulnerable households. The green line you see here represents the historical greenhouse gas emission in the transport sector. To become CO2 neutral, we would need to follow the blue line down to zero emissions, zero CO2 emissions. The orange line represents the existing measures that the government is already implementing. Unfortunately, as you can see, this is not enough. Therefore, we included additional measures in our models, the yellow line. But even that is not sufficient. We are still left with 6 to 10 million tons of CO2 equivalents by 2040 and 2 to 8 by 2050. I will show you our proposed solutions for this problem on slide 6. But first, to our research questions. Which policy measures are necessary to achieve the official decarbonization target by 2040? What impact do these measures have on vulnerable households? How many Austrian households can be classified as vulnerable? Which individual coping strategies are accessible to vulnerable households? And which mitigating measures are necessary to guarantee social fairness? On this slide, you see an overview of our research process. At the macro level, on the left side of the screen, we used a backcasting approach to identify climate-neutral passenger transport scenarios, using two bottom-up system dynamic models in combination with a top-down macroeconomic model. With this macro-level perspective, we identified the policy elements needed for a complete decarbonization by 2040. This part is used to answer my first research questions, the green box. As the two transport models only consider average households with and without access to a car on a district-by-district basis, it is not possible to draw direct conclusions about specific vulnerable groups. Therefore, if you look at the right side of the screen, to answer research question 2 to 5, we used survey data at the micro level of individual households. The data was derived from a combined consumer expenditure and mobility survey and included a 7-day activity diary completed by 908 participants. Let's move to research question 1 and the macro level results. To achieve climate neutrality, certain measures are required. First, we have pull measures, meaning we aim to make CO2 neutral mobility options more attractive. For example, in our models, we include a 50% improvement in public transport services and a 50% improvement in active mobility options, such as better cycling infrastructure. Second, we also have push measures to make CO2-intensive mobility options less attractive. These include a distance-based toll system where larger, more powerful cars pay higher tolls, a gradual expansion and increase of parking fees, and the ecological reform of the commuter allowance. This means that car use should not be longer subsidized, so the commuter allowance would only apply to those who commute using public transport or active mobility. From a technological perspective, now we come to the solution I mentioned earlier. In the baseline scenario, we assume a 67% share of electric vehicles. And in our climate scenario, this would increase to 88% by 2040. However, as I mentioned earlier, we would still have 2 million tons of CO2 left. And why is that? Because by 2040, we still have a share of 12% cars with combustion engines left. These belong to households that depend on cars, but simply cannot afford to switch to an electric vehicle, as they are known to be quite expensive. But as a solution, By then, we will be technologically advanced enough to provide sufficient CO2 neutral e-fuels for the remaining combustion engine vehicles to reach the climate goals. Yeah, you see here the e-fuels in the right corner. Okay, now, how does this affect mobility expenses for Austrian households? Overall, mobility expenses decrease. The reasons for this are rising incomes and lower operating costs of electric vehicles. The initial purchase is expensive, but once you own an electric vehicle, the operating costs are lower. And since we have significantly improved public transport and active mobility, many people can switch to these options, which also reduces mobility costs on average. But there's one problem. In our climate scenario, fuel costs for combustion engines increase by 150%. This means that for people who still own a combustion engine vehicle, mobility expenses will become significantly higher. This means transport poor people who are car dependent and cannot afford an electric car are affected the most, because they are already struggling financially. The diagram on the right shows the share of households affected by transport poverty based on our survey. Approximately 6.6% of households are affected. In this context, transport poverty refers to the affordability of transport options. If households spend 10% or more of their income on mobility, they are defined as transport poor. On the next slide, we have an example household to illustrate this. A single-person household in a rural area with poor access to public transport. In the current situation, our example household can afford mobility and other options and other expenses with the income and save 1%. But what coping strategies, what options does our household have? 50% of the trips and 80% of the car kilometers are work-related, so they cannot be changed or cancelled. Also, the options to switch to other modes are limited. Public transport, for example, would take more than double the travel time compared to using a car. Shorter distances could be shifted to walking and cycling, but this would only cover 13% of the total travel distance. Switching to an electric vehicle is also not possible because our household cannot afford it. The first bar shows the status quo with the 1% saving rate. Looking at the second bar, with a bit of modal shift, using a bike for shorter trips, or reducing car use slightly, they could save 2%. The third bar shows the situation in the climate scenario. And although we have improved public transport, it is unfortunately not feasible to improve it to every location in Austria. There will still be people with poor access to public transport, and these households will continue to rely on cars. In the climate scenario, to achieving climate neutrality, fuel costs for combustion engines increase to 150%. The effect of that you can see if you look at the purple bar at the top of the third bar. It rises significantly compared to the other two. And the saving rate drops to -8%. This means this household would have to go into debt or dip into their savings. With all the coping strategies we just talked about, combined, the saving could be shifted from -8 to -5%, which is still not sustainable over longer periods of time. Therefore, we need an additional climate bonus for these households to help financially, which is around 150 to 200 euros per year. And if that is still not enough, we would need further financial compensation measures for these households. Thank you very much for listening. The QR code links to my LinkedIn page. Please feel free to contact me with any questions or tips.
Thank you, Olivia. Do we have any questions?
Hello everyone. I have a question.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Olivia, for your presentation. It's really interesting. The first thing I would like to ask about is what index have you used to determine the disadvantaged population in Austria? How did you decide if this is considered a disadvantaged population? I mean, what are the variables or indexes you have used?
For this paper, we have just used the affordability. If a household spends 10% or more on mobility costs compared to their income, then they are defined as transport poor.
I see. And here comes the second question. So how have you decided if this criteria, like the 10% of if they spend more than 10% of income, they are considered as mobility poor? Is it a criteria set by the Austrian government or it was used in the literature?
Yes, it's not the newest one, but the Austrian government has set a new one. But it is a recent development. This is about the usability. If a transport person is considered a person is considered as transport poor if the available options are not usable for this individual person. So this depends on various reasons, their fitness level, their destination choices, their time of working hours, maybe they have kids. All of that is included in the newer definition, but the affordability is the one we used for this project.
Okay, so I understand that you decided to set the 10% criteria.
Mm-hmm.
Is that your decision for this research?
Yes, for this one, yeah.
Okay, I see. And one last question. Sorry, I have too many questions. It's an interesting talk. You have also done a survey for 900 people. What criteria have you used to choose those participants?
This was an addition to another survey. And yeah, the people who completed the first survey were asked if they also would like to complete the second one. Actually not sure because my colleague did this survey. But we definitely have various. Oh, thank you, Astrid. You can see a description of the survey in the link. This is the paper about the survey.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So any other questions? I have a question. Because in your model, you assume that there will be a 50% improvement in public transportation, right?
Yes.
But how did you determine this percentage of improvement?
Well, this includes more destination choices for public transport, a higher rate. More people should be able to switch to public transport. And for the model, we just assume a rate of an increased rate of 50%.
Okay, but how do you like test the robustness of your climate scenario against unexpected scenarios that can happen, like the gas price, or if you couldn't have 50% improvement in public transportation quality?
I'm not quite sure because I was not totally involved in the modeling process. But I can ask my colleague and send you an email.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. We also have a question in the chat. Are the incomes, compensations, and costs at current prices or adjusted for inflation? I would assume as costs increase, so does income. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
So they are adjusted.
Yes, they are adjusted.
Okay. But how do you adjust them for 2040?
Well, our colleagues did those, and they are economics. So I believe, yeah, the answers in the chat by my colleague. Thank you. We did some sensitivity analysis, and the 50% are the result of the backcasting.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, other questions? Thank you, Olivia, for your presentation. So we continue with the next presentation. It will be Ani Debnat, our fourth speaker from the University of Arkansas, and he will present his study on how perceived transportation challenges influence travel mode choice in a small US cities.
Thank you. I'm about to share the screen.
Yes, please.
Do you all see the screen here?
Yes, thank you.
Got it. Thank you. It's almost good afternoon here in US. People joining from other continents and other parts of the world. Good afternoon from US. And I am Anindya Debnath, a civil engineering PhD candidate at the University of Arkansas. Thank you to BTR organizers and who made their time available to join this session. I'm really excited to discuss how perceived transportation challenges shape travel mode choices in small US city, a topic that holds significant relevance to sustainable urban mobility as well. Let's take a quick look on the outline of my presentation now. So I'll begin by providing some background to set the context for our research. Then I'll walk you through the research objective. Following that, I'll introduce relevant literature, describe the data sources and methodology used, and show how they help answer specific research questions. Finally, I'll share the results, then conclude with a summary of key insights and implication of this particular study. So to begin with, irrespective of where we live, the need for access to mobility options is universal, irrespective of any scale of geography, be it a big city or a small rural town. The Farman Center at the New York University and the National Center for Education Statistics for both defined small cities are places with fewer than 100,000 population. And this is what we followed to operationalize our definition for small cities. And based on the US Census, average income in these kinds of places is around $35,000, which is about $10,000 to $15,000 less than the larger counterparts. However, transportation costs are higher in small cities. Around 8% of the households are carless, which again is higher than the national average of 5%. Earlier studies using National Household Travel Survey reported that trips here in the small US cities are mostly car-centric, longer and infrequent, which indicates that the dearth of public transport characterized by limited route and limited hours. And all these have a compounding effect on making transportation challenging in these small urban places. So given this context, this particular research dives into understanding the travel behavior of small city residents by analyzing the impact of their perceived transportation challenges on primary transport mode choice. And in doing so, we try to answer two research questions. The first one is, how do perceptions of transportation challenges vary across different demographics in a small city? Or in other words, we can say, who perceive transportation challenges in these places? And the second one, how do this perception of transportation challenges influence their primary transport mode choice? So as part of literature review, when we do literature studies, we see that mobility is vital to livelihood of humans. And the United States Supreme Court has recognized the right to travel as one of the fundamental rights proclaimed by the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. However, discriminatory practices still exist in limiting access to mobility options for the disadvantaged population, who often do not have a car or are too young or too old to drive. Previous studies reported transportation challenges of transit-dependent population that included personal mobility issues related to health, and most importantly for small cities, the increasing number of aging population and high disability rate. So while many of the large city residents are overcoming their first and last mile travel by cycling to transit stations, small cities are struggling with cycling infrastructure, including bike lanes, trails, and bike parking. In many urban areas, sidewalks are narrow, uneven, or poorly maintained, making walking uncomfortable or unsafe. So if we compound these two, presumably they would be less likely to shift to sustainable transportation options if the roads are not safe. However, we don't know how this perception varies across different demographics in small city, or whether this perception has anything to do with their mode choice at the first place. So answer to these questions are vital because they can inform targeted intervention and infrastructure investment that address the specific needs of vulnerable groups, and ultimately leading to a more equitable and sustainable transportation system. So to the best of our knowledge, the scholarly inquiry into mode choice within small cities, within small scale US cities remains kind of limited. Existing literature primarily comprises of summative reports rather than comprehensive examination of the factors that shape mode choice selection. Some studies were conducted on mobility choices for small Chinese cities, and some of them use multinomial logic models, but however, their effort kind of lacked in the discussion on residential self-selection. They argued that residents of small Chinese cities lack the option to choose housing locations that cater to their travel needs. However, in most American cities, the housing system is reported to be highly market-driven, leaving more options for the residents to choose their residential location. So addressing all these issues, we are trying to, given this literature, a gap in the literature and the unique characteristics of small US cities, our study focuses on Fort Smith, Arkansas, a representative small city that exemplifies many of the transportation and land use challenges underexplored in current research. So as part of our data collection effort, we collected data in the form of a travel behavior survey from the residents of Fort Smith aged over 16 years and older, starting from April 2022 through May 2022. The respondents were open to taking the survey either online or paper survey. The paper surveys were mailed out to random 5,000 home addresses, and responses were substantially higher, as you can see, through online surveys than the paper surveys. However, the completion rate was substantially lower through the online survey. So we ended up, after cleaning the data, removing the missing data and other nuisance from the data, we finally had a database of 784 observations. If we take a look at the descriptive statistics in our survey, we asked the respondents to share their perception on transportation challenges in their daily travel. As all you can see, the most reported perceived transportation challenges was related to limited public transit, followed by limited sidewalk, hazardous road, lack of a car, limited bike lane, and others. And the others mostly constituted of physical and health-related challenges. Now, if we take a look at their mode choice modal share, as expected, 2/3 of the respondents reported they use car, followed by only 10% of them use public transit, followed by a small share of walk, cycle, and rideshare services. So we used multinomial logic model, but within the structural equation framework to capture the impact of perceived transportation challenges on their mode choice selection. And in our modeling approach, we used car as the reference category to model transit and active transportation modes. We bundled together personal car and ride-sharing services into car category and biking and walking under active transport category. So the reason we use structural equation model, because SEM kind of allows us to model complex relationships that can capture mediating effects or endogeneity. In our study, we also try to test residential self-selection and car ownership endogeneity in the context of small cities. Earlier travel behavior studies based on large cities, they also reported these variables to have impact on mode choice, plus it allows for simultaneous testing of the entire model. That's the basic reason of using structural equation model and putting multinomial logic model within this framework. So this was the conceptual framework. If I want to explain it, then we hypothesized that built environment variables, including population density and land use mix, in other words, entropy, are influenced by the socioeconomic characteristics of the respondents. And these built environment variables then influence household car ownership and transportation challenges. Car ownership is jointly determined by the built environment and socioeconomic characteristics. And we also hypothesized that individuals' perception of transportation challenges are influenced by their socio-demographic characteristics, built environment characteristics, and household car ownership altogether. Finally, the decision to choose a primary transport mode is explained by the socioeconomic variables, built environment variables, car ownership, and perceived transportation challenges. Now, if we take a look at the results, I'm going to talk mostly about the relationship as opposed to throwing the numbers. So just to keep it generalized, our model results suggest that the perception of transportation challenges vary across different demographics. In summary, if we can tell that older adults, people with no education, low-income individuals, and people who work during weekend and after hours and live in densely populated areas perceive transportation challenges on multiple fronts. One possible reason for the perception of limited public transit is because transit runs only from 7 to 6 and do not run on Sundays. Though prior studies from large city contexts reported to have higher public transit use in densely populated areas, this is not the case in small city Fort Smith, Arkansas. In some part of the city, transit runs along the higher density areas, but people probably still perceive transportation challenges because the transit is only available every hour and they run on a very limited number of routes. Now, if we talk about the second research question, do perceived transportation challenge affect mode choice? And for both of our models, transit and active transport mode, we see the similar relationship with perceived transportation challenges and their mode choice selection. Transit and active transport modes all our results align with our research hypothesis, suggesting that the perception of limited public transit, limited bike lane, lack of sidewalk, and other challenges all affect negatively towards transit and active transport, public transport, active transport options. But in contrast, the perceived carlessness affect more choice in the other way around. So in summary, how if we want to conclude, then we could probably say, yes, perception of transportation challenges is likely to influence more choice towards car. And who are who are perceiving these challenges more than the other, this is we get to see that older adults, people with no education, and low-income individuals, and people who work weekend and after hours, and living in high population densely areas, they're facing more they're perceiving transportation challenges than the other group of people. But the interesting thing is, despite living in high density areas, shift workers employed during weekend and after hours perceive limited transport induced challenges and choose not to use public transit or active transport mode. This is largely due to the lack of after-hour public transportation services and infrequent services along the higher density corridors, and the absence of bike lanes and sidewalk infrastructure. So based on our study, we kind of tried to propose some recommendation. One of those is like enhancing public transit by extending service hours and increasing peak hour frequency along the high density corridors that probably could improve mobility for low income residents. And this improvement may also make transit more appealing to individuals with non-traditional work schedules, which might eventually support both access and transit ridership retention as well. The next one, the addition of protective bike lanes is reported to have a considerably higher safety perception, so which in turn has led to higher bike ridership in prior studies. So protected bike lanes could contribute to increased personal and shared bike share ridership as well. The benefit of investing in bike lanes in many places outweighed the construction cost by huge margin when accounted for the reduced risk of injury, increased probability of ridership, and improved health outcomes as well. And we also saw that older respondents and people from low-income households, they perceive more transportation challenges than the other people. So we are recommending that we are recommending the city to prioritize sidewalk construction in high density areas, because many of the things that we are proposing are kind of a cost burden for the cities, like small cities in US. So we are recommending something that would probably add some incremental cost, but this is probably where they could prioritize their investment. And from our study, to conclude, we didn't see a strong association of residential self-selection. So we couldn't definitely confirm its presence in Fort Smith, but nonetheless, our findings suggest an autocentric preference among respondents, irrespective of their residential location. So this is from my end. Thank you all for listening, and I would like to hear your opinion or questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ani. So questions. Yes, we have a question in the chat. Wondering whether challenges include other factors like comfort, perception of safety, cost of transport, higher travel time, reliance on others.
Nice question, nice observation as well. No, we didn't include these factors that, I mean, to the extent that we didn't specifically ask about comfort or the personal safety, these things, but the way we asked the question that kind of incorporated all these things. When we asked whether you perceive transportation challenges in terms of, because of limited public transit or because of limited bike lane or limited sidewalks. So that kind of partly address the specific issues, while issues or attributes of travel, but we didn't exactly directly ask these things.
Okay, I have a related question.
Sure.
So what about the trip frequency or purpose? Because this might have a great impact.
We definitely have, yeah, we asked this question, but when we tried to, when we were trying to run the model with these variables, that didn't give us, I mean, in terms of goodness of fit, we didn't see much of improvement. Or with this configuration, we ended up having better results. That's why we have this now for now.
What do you mean by better results?
So in terms of goodness of fit, we had a goodness of fit of R square value around 0.69 and a pseudo Efron R square value of 0.64 or 74. But that's the best scenario of goodness of fit we could achieve with this conceptual framework. So with addition or any change in the model didn't give us any better results.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't know if we have any other questions.
Okay.
Yes, we have a recommendation. Thank you very much, Hamidul, for sharing this. And thank you, Ani, for your presentation. It was interesting.
Thank
So
you.
if we don't have any other questions, we continue to the next and final presentation of this session. Shobhit Saxena from the University of Leeds in UK, and he will present his study on the influence of public transport perceptions on demand responsive transport services in the UK. Shobhit. Okay, the last time I checked, he was online.
I am online. I'm just trying to share
Okay,
the
good.
screen. Yeah. Mm. Is the screen visible or?
Not yet. Apparently, we have some microphone issues.
Am I audible now?
We can hear you, but we don't see your slides.
Yeah, I'm sharing now.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Yeah, on mute. We don't hear you.
So it seems whenever I'm sharing screen, my microphone on mute is muted.
So
Yeah.
maybe Hamidul can try to share your slides.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can share his slides. Let me try.
Thank you.
Should I share them to?
Yeah, you need to upload this in the Google Drive. I don't see your slides.
Okay.
Also, if you can try, like next to the audio icon, like there is a small arrow. If you see there, you can check like what speaker is currently selected. You can try
So
with the microphone.
it's working well when I am not sharing the screen.
Yeah. Like
The
after
moment
after sharing the screen, can you try to like check the audio setting here? Like I can see like different options. If you try a different microphone, that might helps.
Am my screen visible now though?
Yeah, choose the default option.
Yeah, now we can hear you and also your slides.
Okay. Is it okay now as well?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry for the glitches. Has to happen, I guess. So good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on which time zone you are on. I am Shobhit, and I'll be presenting my research on understanding the influence of public transport perceptions on demand responsive transport in the UK. So this research is part of a project that is a collaboration between the University of Leeds, University of Southampton, and King's College. So me and this work is predominantly done by me and one of my colleagues, Kiara, who's also one of the co-PIs in the project. So this is going to be the layout of the presentation. I'll start with the motivation of how demand responsive transport have shaped in the US and why we are trying to understand the role of perceptions in the adoption of demand responsive transport. Which I'll follow it with the data that we are using in this study, which was collected as a part of the project. Followed by, I'll discuss briefly of the model framework and key estimation results that we have found up until now, and some of the policy evaluations that we have undertaken. I'll conclude the presentation with a quick summary of the work. So demand responsive transport is generally defined as a flexible service that provide shared transports to users who are generally who have similarities in the temporal and spatial attributes of the trip that they're undertaking. So in a way, it's very similar to a typical public transport offering such as a bus, but it offers the flexibility of on-demand ride-hailing services such as taxi. Without being as expensive as these services. So essentially, DRT services offer benefits of both the traditional public transport modes and the ride-hailing services such as cabs and taxis. So DRT services have been implemented around many cities across Europe and in the US. They have seen varied success across different contexts, but particularly in Europe, DRT services have been quite successful and have been serving the population in urban as well as rural regions. However, in the UK, while the DRT services have been quite successful in the rural areas, their success in the urban areas has seen mixed results. Despite the significant support from the Department for Transport, which included funding in addition of £21 million over the last decade, most DRT services have struggled financially and which has led to their closure even in the first 2 years of their trial phase. Now, the low ridership of these DRT services, despite despite these servicing being attractive in terms of offering flexibility, having digital on app support, and offering real-time ride tracking, these services have not quite been able to generate as much attraction. In fact, one of the studies in 2020 identified that more than 67% of the DRT services in the UK failed, which is quite more than other services around the world, which I believe stands at around 50% globally. Now, this lack of success of DRT, particularly in the UK urban areas, is a mystery which hasn't been understood well. There have been several studies that have analyzed the adoption of DRT services, but mostly in the rural areas. In the urban areas, one such example of a service that had to be discontinued was Flexibles, that was introduced in Leeds in 2021. The service had the operational purposes of serving residents that did not have access to reasonable transport, and at the same time, it also one of the purposes was to support modal shift away from private cars. However, within the first 2 years, the service had to be discontinued as it never attained target ridership, and due to which the service struggled financially. So when we started this project, we had a quick discussion with the transport provider in Leeds region. And what we were told is that these services share quite a lot of similarities with the public transport services. And how people perceive existing public transport services in the area has a lot of bearing on how people perceive these DRT services as well. So in a way, it becomes very important to understand, in addition to the factors that influence the adoption, how people perceive public transport services in the region and how they affect the adoption of a new transport service that is quite similar to the existing public transport service. So with this understanding, the objective of our work was first, identify factors that influence the adoption of DRT service, particularly in large urban regions such as Leeds. And second, we wanted to understand how these perceptions, the prevailing perceptions of the existing PT infrastructure, influence the adoption of these new DRT services. In addition to doing so, we also wanted to test policies as to how the improvements in the existing PT infrastructure would impact the adoption or attractiveness of DRT services. So with this motivation, we focused on the Great Leeds area, which is where I am based right now. And the motivation was actually two-phase. It involved two phases, essentially. One was that one of the earlier implementation of the DRT service wasn't as successful. And of course, we wanted to understand what factors could have influenced its adoption and what could be done better in that aspect. And the second, an important aspect was how the existing public transport in Leeds is structured. So if you look at the two panes in the bottom, the first pane on the left shows the train system, the rail system in the Leeds area. And the second, the one with colored lines, shows the existing bus network. While the bus network might appear a bit dense, it's quite evident that this is a radial bus network, which essentially means that if a traveler is traveling from the core city center area to any area, he or she will have uh, better access or better chances of using public transport. But if you are based somewhere in the peripheral regions or somewhere, and if you want to move in areas that are not connected with the city center, you might have to come to the city center in order to make a transfer and then move on to the area that you want to visit. So this radial network actually motivated the implementation of DRT services, but despite the fact the DRT services could not succeed or attract ridership. So with these two motivating factors, we tried to analyze the factors that influence the adoption of DRT services in this region. To do so, we collected the data as part of the project where we uh, implemented a choice experiment enabled survey. In the survey, we seeked information on social demographic information and trip contextual attributes, where we asked respondents to report trips that they take at least once in a 2-month window. For the choice experiment design, we pivoted off the reported trip, where we used a de-efficient pivot design, where the reported trip was used to generate choice scenarios, which respondents would answer under the condition that DRT is available as one of the alternatives that they could choose from. In addition to those, we also asked respondents of their perception of the existing PT infrastructure. These perceptions were based on reliability, safety, affordability, and connectivity. And we asked respondents to rate each of these perceptions on Likert scale rating. As I'll show later, we only asked for one indicator for each of these perception variables, and which is typically difficult to accommodate in a hybrid choice model. But as I'll show later, we were able to formulate a model with single indicators with certain assumptions, of course, in the model framework. So the choice experiment design was based off these attributes, where we included in-vehicle travel time, cost, access, egress, parking cost, width of time window, which is essentially the time window around which the ride would be available if it was a DRT. For other attributes of DRT, we included vehicle type, which is car, minivan, minibus, and number of stops. So based on these design attributes, this is an example of the choice card that was presented to the respondents. We presented 4 such choice cards where the respondents were asked to choose which mode they would prefer if DRT is available as one of the potential modes. So finally, our survey was distributed by one of the marketing companies, and most of our respondents comprised of online panel. We also distributed the survey via flyers to around 8,000 households, and we also put an effort to collect data from face-to-face interviews. However, our face-to-face interviews were not as successful, with only 2% of the entire respondents that we have coming from those face-to-face interviews. Most of a survey comprised of online panel, which was around 80%. Because of that, there are some dissimilarities from the population distribution when we compare it with the sample composition that we have. So sample is fairly representative in terms of gender, car ownership, employment, and age distribution. However, there is a subtle difference in the age category of 65 and above, where our survey could not replicate the existing share, the distribution of older age population. And this is one of the artifacts of having an online panel. When it comes to the modal split in our sample, the sample is quite similar in terms of car usage. However, because our focus was primarily on DRT services, we dropped all trips that were less than a kilometer, and because of which the share of active transport was quite low in our sample. And because of which the share of public transport or bus and train increased in our sample. So if you look at the blue arrow, which represents active transport, which is 29% in the prevailing population, we only had 16%, whereas the share of public transport was 25% in our sample as opposed to 9%. Now, this is an artifact of dropping short distance trips, which are less than a kilometer, because DRT is anyway not suitable for such trips. With this sample, we formulated a model which could incorporate the effect of perceptions of each of the 4 perceptions that we had in our survey, and its influence on the mode choice decisions. So if you look at the framework, the perception of reliability, perception of safety, perception of connectivity, and affordability all influence the mode choice decisions. And all of these perceptions are inferred by a Likert scale response to reliability, safety, connectivity, and affordability. However, since we only had single indicator for each of these perception variables, we did so because of 2 primary reasons. So in a typical ICLV framework, where you would have multiple indicators influencing a single perception, it becomes very difficult to have objective measures that influence only one indicator and does not influence other indicators. So essentially, it leads to mechanical dependencies across indicators, which does not allow any possible policy evaluations. So an example of that would be if, let's say, you want to improve the perception of reliability in a typical ICLV framework. If you represent the perception being transport satisfaction or satisfaction of public transport, all of your indicators would influence the perception of public transport. And if you just improve reliability, it would lead to the improvement in safety, connectivity, and affordability as well. So this leads to the mechanical dependencies which have to be avoided if you are evaluating specific policies that target improvement in each of these perception variables. So with this in mind, we only included single indicator for each of the perception. However, this means that the error in the structural equation and error in the measurement equation is confounded. So this is a trade-off that as an analyst, one would have to make, because misspecification due to multiple indicators could lead to biases as well. And avoiding and confounding of measurement error and structural error would also lead to some residual bias. In our case, since we wanted to evaluate specific policies, we made a choice of having a single indicator. With this understanding, we formulated the model, which is based on a multivariate probit kernel. So I would not go into the specifics of the model formulation, but one thing that's important to note here is that the loadings of the perception variables that enter the utility, which is this term, gamma k beta zk and gamma k nk. So these loadings of the perception variables also incorporate systematic correlations. And since these systematic correlations between the perceptions and the mode choice decisions are incorporated via factor loadings, we assumed that the error terms in the utility, in the mode choice utilities, and error terms in the structural equation of the perception, we assume that there are no extra correlations. With this assumption, actually, it had multiple benefits. One is that the final covariance matrix that we derived was positive definite once this assumption was validated. And since we already have the perceptions affecting the mode choice utilities directly, there is no need to assume that the error terms in the structural equations of these perceptions are correlated with the mode utilities. So we estimated this model while after deriving the likelihood, we estimated the models, and the estimation results indicated that the perceptions of public transport are worse in women. So essentially, women have worse perceptions of across all the four attributes of perceptions: reliability, safety, connectivity, and affordability. As age increases, these perceptions tend to get worse. So reliability is better for younger individuals where they feel that they have multiple options, but as one becomes older, these perceptions sort of get worse. In terms of the built environment, population density, so people living in denser areas have better perceptions as opposed to people who live in sparse areas. Now, the last two attributes that we included, which is antisocial number of antisocial incidents and number of bus stops in the zone, the effects of these are specific to each of the perception category. So the number of antisocial incidents was only entered in the perception of safety, and the number of bus stops in the zone was only entered in the perception of connectivity. Now, these two measures serve as objective measures that could lead to that could be thought of as measures that could be used as policy variables to improve safety and connectivity perceptions. In a typical setting, when multiple indicators are used, this would not be possible, as these objective measures would influence all four perception variables rather than each specific perception variable. In terms of choice model results, women are found to have a higher preference for DRT. However, younger individuals tend to have a better preference for DRT as compared to individuals who are in the age category of 35 to 64, essentially the working age group. Population density, high population density means less car usage, but we did not find any significant differences in the usage of bus, train, and DRT services. Our level of service attributes were all as expected, with negative signs across all the four primary modes. In terms of attributes that were specific to DRT services, we only included vehicle type. Individuals tend to have a higher preference for minibus, which is followed by minivan, and car is least preferred mode for a DRT service. Now, if you look at the right pane, these are the factor loadings of the perception attributes on the mode choice. So essentially, the perception of reliability, safety, and connectivity not only influences bus and train, which is the traditional public transport offering, but also of DRT and in the same direction. Essentially, this means that the systematic correlations between the prevailing public transport mode and this new DRT service is positive, which means that DRT service and train and bus need not be competitors, which is quite contrary to what the perception is about these DRT services being in direct competition with buses and trains. Finally, we undertook some policy evaluations to further find evidence of our assertions that these services are complementary to each other. So we devised two pull policies which were directed at improvement of public transport, of the prevailing public transport perceptions. Specifically, we evaluated a policy where the number of bus stops in each LSOA were increased by 20%. LSOA is a zonal aggregation that's quite common in the UK. And the second policy that we targeted was the number of antisocial crime instances were reduced by 20%. As we can see, both of these pull policies not only resulted in a positive perception and percentage higher adoption of buses and train, but it also leads to higher adoption of DRT service, which means that these services are quite complementary in nature. Interestingly, we also saw a reduction of car usage, which means that if these services are complementary, one can make a case where introduction of a DRT service can actually lead to lesser reliance on private car usage. We also tested another policy as a push policy away from private cars, where we increased the parking fare by 25%, which resulted in the most reduction in private car usage, and which also saw an increment in the usage of public transport, the existing public transport and DRT. So to conclude, our findings did indicate that when a new DRT service is introduced, the prevailing perceptions of the existing public transport do play a role. How these, in our empirical case at least, we could see that these services, the new DRT services, are complementary to the existing public transport options, which actually is contrary to the prevailing sentiment about DRT services. Now, this is very interesting because when a new DRT service comes, because of how the public transport infrastructure in the UK is positioned, the bus companies tend to be a bit pessimistic about their worry that the shares might reduce from public transport usage. However, we see that public transport usage might not suffer as much as it's made out to be. And in fact, if one improves public transport, it may also have a positive impact on DRT services. So in all, the DRT services, along with the existing public transport service, can in fact work in cohesion and sort of become a part of a larger public transport framework where all these services are available to the residents. Policies also indicated similar trends, and from a methodological standpoint, the use of single indicator did allow us to evaluate these policies, however, at the cost of confounding between the structural and the measurement errors. So it becomes then the call of the analyst on which how the framework should be. Of course, in fact, if you have multiple indicators for each of the perception variable, then it's advisable to use all those multiple indicators. But ours is a more parsimonious approach in a way where we only used single indicator. With this, I'll finish the presentation, and hopefully, if there are any questions, happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Shobhit. Unfortunately, we won't have time for the questions. So please, if you have questions, reach out to Shobhit with emails or in the chat. Hamidur has shared the list of the next sessions in the chat, so please have a look. Thank you very much all for joining us today, and I wish you enjoy the rest of the conference.